This week, my interview with writer Mark Russell, how he got into comics, why he told the story of gays in the 1950s and the McCarthy hearings using 1960s Hanna-Barbera characters, the inspiration for Billionaire Island, and more. But first, help keep this podcast coming out weekly. Support the show at patreon.com/deconcomics. With your pledge, you can access hours of bonus podcasts of Mulele and me reviewing Marvel Comics movies and more. And you can join me to discuss the comic of your choice on the show. Pledge your support now at patreon.com/deconcomics. This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo. I recently spoke with writer Mark Russell about several of his past series and about his view of the world and the comics industry. So let's get right into it. All right, I'm talking with Mark Russell. How are you doing?
Good.
Now, you in Portland?
Yeah, Portland, Oregon.
Okay.
Not to be confused with Portland, Maine.
Right.
Or any of the other Portlands.
How many Portlands are there?
It's probably dozens. I mean, every state that's got a coast probably has a Portland, I would imagine.
Yeah, it could be. Almost as many as there
Pretty
are Springfields.
Pretty uncreative name when you think about it.
The land of ports.
It's like saying mountain land or river land. It's like almost like Springfield or something.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm interested in knowing what comics were your favorites when you were growing up.
Well, when I was a kid, I really much just kind of read the comics that were on the spinner racks. You know, I read Mighty Mouse, Richie Rich, maybe the occasional Batman. But the first sort of comic that I really sort of gravitated towards, I made a point of getting on a regular basis, was Mad Magazine. So I think that was, in terms of comics, that was probably my biggest early influence.
Okay. Explains a lot, too.
Yeah, it probably does. You don't have to be like Sigmund Freud to figure out the connection. I think, the weird thing was, I remember reading the movie parodies in Mad Magazine, and it was like when I was a kid and I hadn't really seen any, very many movies. But then I would go see the movies based upon the Mad Magazine parodies, and I was always disappointed in the movies themselves. I enjoyed the Mad Magazine parodies more.
I hardly ever get to movies, so I would read the parodies to find out what the movies were about.
Yeah, I quickly stumbled upon that strategy. It's like you're better off just reading the parody and skipping the movie altogether.
So how did you get into writing comics, and how did you end up putting out your first book from one of the big two?
Well, I've been writing in various formats for as long as I can remember, but comics specifically, I didn't really get into until 2015 when I started writing Prez, which was also my first big two comic.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, how did you get that gig?
Yeah, how did it materialize?
Yeah.
This is not really going to be a duplicable sort of.
They never are.
Anybody who's listening for tips on how to break in, this is I'm probably the worst person you could be listening to.
Well, I've heard everybody has their own unique path into it, and there's no preordained path that everybody follows.
No, the most common thread, I think, is that people usually get in through the side door. They don't get in through the traditional portfolio submission, process, and they usually come in through some other medium or because they've been doing something else. And that was the case with me. I'd been writing, I'd written a couple books. I'd written 2 books about the Bible, one called God Is Disappointed in You and one called Apocrypha Now. And, but weirdly, neither one of them really got me discovered in comics. What got me discovered in comics was the Count Chocula fan fiction I was writing on Facebook, which Marie Javins, who is now editor-in-chief at DC, stumbled upon. And at the time, she was looking for somebody who could write sort of satirical comic books because they were looking for someone to write Prez. and there's not like a huge stable of sort of funny satirical writers at DC. Their writers tend to be more like action and mystery or science fiction oriented.
Mm-hmm.
So she was reading my Count Chocula fan fiction on Facebook, and she said, well, why not this guy? We'll take a chance on him. So they took a chance on me, for better or for worse. And that's kind of how I got into comics.
Okay, well, I want to know more about this Count Chocula fan fiction.
Well, weirdly, it kind of became the tail wagging the dog, where I started writing this just as prose on my Facebook page. And then from there, I got into comics. And then after I got sort of established in comics, I was able to pitch my Count Chocula fan fiction from Facebook to Ahoy, and they've been publishing it through their Edgar Allan Poe's Snifter of Terror, which is now like the Edgar Allan Poe's Snifter of Blood. But they've been publishing these sort of serial monster stories. I had stories about Frankenberry and Blueberry and Captain Crunch, none of whom are actually used in my stories. I use sort of legally permissible facsimiles of those characters. But yeah, they've been publishing them through Ahoy. So the Count Chocula fan fiction turned me into a comic book writer, which in effect turned the Count Chocula fan fiction into a comic book.
I see. Okay, interesting. So I've read a number of your books. I read Flintstones. I read Second Coming. I read part of Prez. I never finished it. And then I read this week. I read Billionaire Island, and I read Snagglepuss. And when I read your work, I'm struck by how often the characters make their points with such perfect wording, and I think, wow, that's interesting, or that's true, I should remember that. But then a page later, there's another one, and then there's another one, and I'd have to memorize half the book to keep all those in mind.
A lot easier when I get a chance to go back and constantly revise what I just said. I wish I was like that in real life, where it's like people didn't hear me speak until like 3 days later after I had to refine it and get it perfect. But that's one of the advantages you have as a writer. And I think, what you lose in the verisimilitude of conversation, you gain in the fact that you're able to sort of make these points very poignantly and succinctly in a way you can't just, going off the top of your head. And I think that's really what I like. My philosophy of writing is really one of like trying to create the biggest crater with the smallest rock possible. So a lot of what I do is trying to create as much truth as I can in as few words as possible. And comics really lends itself to that process.
How so? How does comics?
Well, it rewards economics. It rewards being economical with your words and whatnot. And also the visuals do a lot of that work for you. So you don't have to like flood your page with a lot of words describing the scenery and the world and stuff. So all that's really left in the balloons is what you have to say. The one line that which you are summarizing that person's thoughts, that character's position in the world. And so it really lends itself to like that sort of pithy or witty dialogue.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. Another thing I experience repeatedly with your books is that I laugh at something and then feel like, oh, I might be laughing inappropriately. Was I supposed to laugh at that? I mean, this is also kind of a tragic thing. Was it a joke? I'm not sure.
That's a common feeling. And I think, there's a George Saunders line, which has sort of become my guiding light. He says that humor is just the truth faster than you expected it. And so I feel like there are those moments where you should be sort of uneasy, and it's still okay to laugh because it's funny because it's so tragic, and it's tragedy like penned into one sentence.
Yeah. Sometimes it's just like the exaggeration of the point. Like, Billionaire Island has a lot of that, where you just kind of taken it up a notch, which is a way to make something funny, but it's in the service of really serious points.
Yeah, a lot of what I write, like if I had to describe myself, a lot of people describe me for me as a satirist, but if I had to describe myself, I'd probably describe myself more as a fabulist. What I write are really kind of fables for the world as I see it. And Billionaire Island is certainly a fable.
I see. Okay. Now, I never understood why DC did that run of miniseries of kind of more serious takes on 1960s Hanna-Barbera characters.
I don't either, but
some of which people younger than 50 weren't even familiar with.
Right.
But were you familiar with like Snagglepuss before you wrote that book?
I don't think I'd ever seen a full Snagglepuss cartoon. I mean, I knew who Snagglepuss was, and I'd watched Flintstones cartoons when I was a kid, but I watched them mostly because they were on after school. I didn't really watch them because I was a huge Flintstones fan or because I found them funny, which I didn't really. I watched them because they were on. And yeah, I knew the other Hanna-Barbera characters, mostly from Wacky Races and other cartoons, but I never really, I mean, obviously I was too young to watch the original Snagglepuss cartoons, which ran in like late 50s and 60s. But yeah, I was aware of them. I just had never really watched a full cartoon, which I think kind of helped me in terms of writing, because I wasn't trying to do an homage to them. I was just using them as launching points from which to do my own thing.
Yeah, well, in my grandparents' TV market, there was a show that in the early to mid 70s that did show Snagglepuss, so I was familiar with him and some of the others. But so reading your Snagglepuss, it took me a while to kind of get past the question of why. Why is this story being told with these characters? And at the end, I kind of, after thinking about it a few days, I kind of think I might have figured it out, but I want to hear it from you. Why did you decide to tell that story with these characters?
Well, I had started writing these little shorts with Snagglepuss as a Southern Gothic writer, because the two things I knew about Snagglepuss were that, one, he's a gay icon, and two, he's got a background in theater, which I thought was kind of odd for a cartoon character, because all his catchphrases are theater terms.
Yeah, exit stage
left is a stage term, and Heavens to Murgatroyd is like from a gosh, I forget which. I want to say I forget which musical duo, but it's from a musical. So I thought, well, this is what I'm going to build the story around. I'm going to build it around the fact that he's a gay icon and that he has a background in theater. And from there, how does he go from theater into television? I knew that his first appearance in television, based upon my extensive research in Wikipedia, was that he first showed up in 1959 on the Quick Draw McGraw variety show. So then that sort of from those three things, I was able to sort of construct the story where he was a playwright, but he was forced out for some reason. And what was going on in the 50s? It was the Red Scare and the Lavender Scare. So he's forced out by the House Un-American Activities. And then Quick Draw McGraw got him into cartoons. So it was a way to sort of make up for how he had hurt Snagglepuss and of course, even more severely, Huckleberry Hound, Snagglepuss's friend.
Okay. I hadn't been aware that he was a gay icon, although clearly the character was kind of coded gay.
Yeah, he's very effective. And obviously the cadence of my Snagglepuss is very different than the cadence of speech of the one in the cartoons. But I thought that, his style, his manner was really much more like a Tennessee Williams. He was like sort of a gay Southern Gothic playwright with a very refined style. So I made him he's more based upon Tennessee Williams than he is based upon the Snagglepuss of the cartoons.
Now, what did that mean at the end that he went into cartoons? Because he looks more realistic than the cartoon version. Are they like animating from him, or I didn't quite get what that meant?
Yeah, I guess in that universe, the cartoons would be that you're doing the voice of drawn facsimiles of yourself.
Okay.
The cartoon world is one in which humans and animals sort of interact seamlessly. You might have like Yogi the Bear talks to the park ranger who's a human. Mm-hmm. So I thought, well, that's the cartoons that are just sort of like an artistic reflection of that world. And that the world that Snagglepuss is actually living is just sort of a live action version of the animated world he goes into.
Okay, I guess that makes sense. Although I saw Like Quick Draw McGraw's sidekick was actually standing there in the studio looking like his cartoon version.
Yeah. We didn't spend a lot of time worrying about the vagaries of that. But yeah, that's generally how I envisioned it.
Okay. And we saw a drawing of the cartoon version of Quick Draw McGraw. We never saw a cartoon version of Snagglepuss in the story. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, it was more about him, keeping him in the real universe, and him, like, his countries. Well, that would have been a good idea. I think maybe instead of the blackout at the end, if we had like actually some cartoon still of like Snagglepuss as he actually looked in the cartoons, that maybe had been a better last panel to leave people on than just the all black with the description of the postscript.
Mm-hmm. So I had just a few questions about Flintstones. Most importantly, what does it mean to punch someone in the beef?
It's just something I came up with. It's I never, it wasn't really anything that I drew upon. And so I just imagine it being punching somebody in their muscles, like punching somebody in the chest or the gut or something. But it just sounded better to say punching someone in the beef because it's so mysterious. It's like, ooh, what is he going to do to me?
Yeah, well, I know the guys on the iFanboy podcast were just cracking up about that.
Yeah, because if I say I'm going to punch you in the gut, or I'm going to punch you in the chest, it's instantly forgettable. It's like not really interesting at all. But if I say I'm going to punch you in the beef, then yeah, all of a sudden it kind of takes you back. Like, what do you mean by that? It becomes more ominous.
Okay. Now, I was rereading the first few issues this morning, and Ralph the Bully sounds an awful lot like Trump. And I know that this was coming out during the 2016 campaign. Was that intentional?
Yeah, totally intentional. The issue number 5, which is about the election, which Ralph is kind of the main character, him and Claude the Destroyer, they're both sort of facsimiles of Trump, but one's like sort of one's about sort of the juvenile pettiness of Trump, and the other one's more about sort of the gross incompetence of Trump. And so, yeah, it was really on both levels, kind of like talking about like Ralph, like how these sort of bullies like manage to like bowl over their opposition and capture the imagination of the voters, and then also about like the danger of letting them do that because they're going to lead you into bad places. So Claude the Destroyer is kind of like Ralph the Bully as an adult.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Now, why did the Flintstones keep changing gods in that book? We had Peaches, we had Gerald.
Well, because it's about the transition that human beings made after they began civilizing from animism to more abstract god worship, and ultimately to monotheism. Because at the beginning they're worshiping animals, they're worshiping this bird because the bird led them to watering holes. The bird, showed them when to like go south for the winter and north for the summer. So the bird was like sort of their spirit animal, was their guide, which is the way we approached deities when we were hunter-gatherers. We looked to animals for signs about nature, and we respected them, and they fed us, and they clothed us, and we respected them as these forces of nature, and lived sort of like almost in awe of the animals, even though we were also hunting them. And then once we civilized and started putting down roots and raising animals, domesticated animals, and using them as like labor, it became hard to sort of venerate them after that, because they were, it'd be like it was in the Flintstones, like worshiping the vacuum cleaner. It's like, well, these are just tools. These are just appliances that we use around the house. They're not gods. So they had to come up with a more abstract approach to deities to fulfill themselves spiritually. And that's where Gerald comes in, the invisible god.
I see. I found it interesting that while all the human characters look a lot more realistic than in the original cartoon, Dino looks basically the same. What was the thinking there?
That wasn't really planned on my part. That was sort of Steve Pugh's decision. So I don't know. You have to ask him. But I do think that like Dino is probably the most true to the actual cartoon character of any of them, because he's just a dog and he's like happy, yappy, and happy to see everyone. Although we do the one departure from the cartoon for Dino is that when he's with other animals, he actually talks to them. He's like sort of like doesn't just yap and then he can actually. And in fact, that was one of the few things that DC told me. One of the few guidelines they gave me when I started writing the Flintstones was like, humans can talk to humans and animals can talk to animals, but they can't breach the gap. Animals can't converse with human beings. And that became like one of the guiding principles of writing it. It's like, well, it's sort of like upstairs, downstairs. The servants talk to the servants, and the nobility talk to the nobility, and neither one really understands the lives of the other.
Okay, but yeah, I mean that's the show sort of kept Dino separate from the appliance animals. It didn't seem to even notice each other, so that was kind of an extra step that you added.
Right, and that's definitely something I wanted to do, because I wanted to like show like there would be resentment there, because they see Dino as a traitor, because he's like they kind of hate the humans because the humans are their bosses and they're making them work, and Dino's like their lapdog. Dino's like gets all the good treatment, and he is completely sucking up to the humans. So they sort of revile Dino. They see him as like a species traitor.
Sure. Okay. Coming up, the inspiration for Billionaire Island. How does Mark see Judge Dredd's caricature of America? And how does he feel about being the only writer of his kind in mainstream comics? Thanks to our supporters on Patreon, another set of classic early episodes of Deconstructing Comics have been unlocked, and I'm putting them back on the site in reverse order. This week I'll republish number 43 from October 2nd, 2006, in which Brandon and I discuss Bone, She-Hulk, Moon Knight, and Why the Last Man. Find the classic episodes on our Facebook and Twitter feeds by choosing the earliest months listed in the sidebar pull-down menu at deconstructingcomics.com, in publicly available posts on our Patreon page, or in the Patreon smartphone app. Classic episodes have been unlocked back to number 31, so only 12 more classic episodes will be re-released, unless we meet our next Patreon goal, unlocking 15 more classic episodes and putting our Full Metal Alchemist podcast, The Law of Equivalent Exchange, in its own feed and on a more frequent release schedule. Check out all our goals and help us reach them at patreon.com/deconcomics. In the latest episode of To the Batpoles podcast, a long-lost Batman film revealed, the first known Batman 66 fan film made on 16mm film in the spring of 1966 by a group of high school seniors. Paul and I talked with collector Mitchell Kaba, who discovered it, and with John Powers, one of the students involved in making the film. Watch the video on our site and then listen to the podcast to hear how it was made and how it was rediscovered 54 years later. Find us at tothebatpoles.libsyn.com or in any podcast app. A new piece of Batman history revealed on To the Batpoles. Billionaire Island. Now, I understand this series was inspired by a news report you saw, so tell us about that.
Yeah, actually a few, but yeah, there was one I saw about billionaires trying to, buying bug-out bunkers in New Zealand and thinking about how they're going to secure them against the marauding hordes after the apocalypse. And then also, there's one about like them building the plans to build an artificial island off the coast of San Francisco where they can avoid all the taxes of like San Francisco and California, but still like sort of enjoy the proximity to like the tech industry, ignoring the fact that it's the taxes and the infrastructure that they build that make that tech industry possible there, and having an educated workforce that they would need to run a tech industry there, and also just sort of the idea that this is much more likely if they're acting cost effectively and they're thinking about the bottom line, which they always do. This is much more likely for them to do than actually trying to save the rest of the world. They're much more likely just to pull up stakes and go hang out on an island and let the rest of us fight it out over the last cans of beans than they are to try to forestall global climate change or resource depletion or the collapse of our ability to raise food in the way we're used to raising it.
Okay, so for people who haven't read any of it yet, explain what the story is about.
The premise is basically a bunch of billionaires create an artificial island in the Gulf of Mexico to wait out the end of the world. But there is a journalist and also an aggrieved former military, like special forces guy, who go looking for the billionaires on this island. That complicates their lives enormously. And that just sort of sets it up.
Okay. So in making or satirizing the rich is kind of struck to me as a little bit obvious thing to do, although you do it well. But I thought the point I liked the best in the story was when it's pointed out that everyone just acts in their own best interest, which made me think, like, if somehow a rich person and a non-rich person suddenly had their bank accounts switched, the newly rich person would not act any better than the previously rich person had.
That's probably true. And that's part of what I wanted the takeaway to be from that. It's like, not that these billionaires are evil. They're inherently worse people than the people they're screwing. It's that there is a system set up so that somebody's always on that chair screwing everyone below them. It's really the system and the architecture of hierarchy in the world that's the villain, not these individual people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what can be done about that? Any prescriptions?
Well, you have to change the architecture, and I think that's what sort of Shelley refers to, sort of at the end, is like taking a chance on building something new, because you can't just the same system and hope that good people are going to populate the throne, because they won't. The throne will, by its nature, make them bad people.
Okay. And now, since the story takes place mainly on the island, which doesn't have any laws, the story doesn't really deal with the role of governments. But, governments don't seem to be capable of solving the problem either.
They do have a government on Billionaire Island, but it's a very loose kind of government. They just sort of, it's an oligarchy, basically, where the ruling council sort of makes decisions collectively. And they have a chairman who's by law the richest person on the island, which in this case is a dog, just because the dog inherited this enormous amount of wealth, which it invests wisely by eating out of dog food bowls with the names of different corporations on them, which his butler then invests the dog's money in the corporation whose bowl he eats out of. And this has proven to be a better investment strategy than anything the money managers and the hedge fund managers have managed to come up with, making business dog the richest mammal on the planet. So they do have a structure there. It's not complete anarchy. But yeah, I think the reason why the governments on the mainland can't do anything about it, though, is precisely because of the billionaires. They don't want anything to be done about a system which profits them enormously, and which it's much more cost effective for them to retreat to this island and wait out the end of the world than it is for them to pay the taxes necessary to forestall the end of the world. And in fact, there's a scene in Billionaire Island where the economist in the swimming pool says, "Oh no, I crunched the numbers, and if we just raise the tax rate by like 8%, we could save everybody with these sort of self-sustaining cities." And the next thing you see is the drones carrying him out to sea because he suggested raising their taxes. So it's not that the governments can't solve the problem so much as they're not allowed to, because the solution is not agreeable to the people who would rather spend that money saving themselves on an offshore island than saving all of us for slightly, for a slightly higher price tag.
Okay. Now I haven't read your Judge Dredd, but one of my co-conspirators on this podcast, Emmett, has, and he had a question for me to ask you about it. So he wrote to me, "Classic Judge Dredd stories drew from the impressions of UK and European creators of a dystopian futuristic USA. How did Mark Russell, as an American, view this interpretation of America?"
Yeah, that's a good valid observation, because yes, Judge Dredd is sort of like how British people view sort of gun-happy, law and order Americans. And it is a caricature. It is like a satire. Right? People see Judge Dredd as this hero, as a sort of aspirational figure. That's not the way he's intended. He's intended to be sort of like a satire of us. So the way I wanted to approach it, which is slightly different, is like less of a satire as a guy who's just the product of the system, but is ultimately just trying to do his best within the system. So my approach to Judge Dredd was a little different than the traditional British approach to Judge Dredd, and partially because I am an American and I see this society from the inside and not from the outside. So I wanted to make somebody who like is like living within the system and reacting to it, not necessarily as like somebody's a fascist or like wants to, just like a sociopath, but as somebody who's just acting according to the incentives that have been laid out before him in this society.
Okay. Now, all of your work is really motivated by opinions you want to express, which seems really unusual for mainstream comics. And Emmett points out there have been periods of left-leaning monthly comics like Marvel in the 70s, but usually most of the mainstream stories have just been, about action and didn't really have much deeper to say. So why do you feel so motivated to do this kind of writing, and what's your thought about the lack of it in mainstream comics?
Well, the thing that really makes me want to write, the thing that really gets me writing is the fact that I have something to say about the world. That's what I'm passionate about. And I think that's what you should write about. You should write about the things that like stir you, the things that sort of haunt you, and the things you can't stop thinking about. I could write these very mercenary, just sort of like color in the lines superhero stories that are basically just like professional wrestling storylines, tag team matchups or crossovers, which villains have they not fought in a while? Who have they not teamed up with in a while? But I don't think it's very gratifying to anybody. I think those are kind of boring and lazy, and you feel like that's a writer working on autopilot when I read those stories. What I like are the stories that this is somebody writing about themselves. This is somebody writing about the things that haunt them or the things they're really into. And so I feel like I'd be doing a disservice to the readers if I didn't similarly write about the things that really mean something to me.
Mm-hmm. How do you feel the comics industry is receiving the work you do, since not many other people are doing something like this?
Well, I think that's kind of why they are receiving it all, is because it's sort of unique. It's not really if you're going to do the sort of professional wrestling storyline comics, you better be super good at it, because there's a lot of people already doing that. So it's kind of refreshing. I think this is maybe why I've gotten some slack, in the comics business, to do the sorts of things I want to do, because not many people are writing satire. Not many people are writing their sort of laying out their soul on what they think is happening to the world. And it's a shame, because comics are a medium that sort of really loans itself to that sort of subversive and explorative thinking, because by the time you're writing a TV show or a movie, you've got focus groups you've got to answer to, you got executives looking over your shoulder, whereas comics are much cheaper to produce. You should be taking big chances when writing comics, I feel.
Mm-hmm. Have you considered doing any comics about political polarization? It's watching it from over here. I live in Japan, but it's been pretty unnerving to see what's going on.
Yeah, definitely. I think that if I were to write a second season of Billionaire Island, that's what it would be about. It would be about how people of the sort of Rashomon effect, where people are looking at the implosion of Billionaire Island and taking different things away from it. And like one section of American society builds this cult around Business Dog, sort of like a Trumpian cult around Business Dog. And then another part is like, no, we need to take advantage of this to completely rebuild a new system in its place. But I think that a lot of it is like about that polarization, about how two groups of people can view the same series of events through incredibly different lenses.
Mm-hmm. Now, listeners are probably going to expect me to ask you about your leaving Dynamite. So just briefly explain what happened and where the situation stands now.
Well, I was working with Dynamite. Like I was doing a series. I'm actually still technically doing Red Sonja, even though it's all written and it's all turned in, and I'm not really actively working anymore, but it's still coming out. And I'd done the Lone Ranger Devil's Rope series with them, and I had a good experience working with Dynamite. But at some point, they sort of got into bed with the Comicsgate group, which is this. So I'm not going to mince words. They're a hate group. I've seen them like online, like harassing so many other creators because they're women, or because they're transgendered, and it just appalls me. It just appalls me every time I see them engaging in one of these harassment campaigns. And so then the idea that my work would be sort of advertised, and I saw this like ads, Dynamite posting ads for my work, and then like a minute later for one of these guys who had just seen harassing one of my friends or somebody I knew in the comics world, and it just ate me up. It's like, well, and even if they weren't friends of mine, just on principle, it's just like, how can I feel like if I say nothing, if I'm just a party, if I'm allowing my work to be used in this way, then I'm complicit in what they're doing. So I spoke to Nick, and Nick understood my where I was coming from, and he also understood why it was a bad idea to get involved with this group and the people, the harassers within it. So I told him that I wasn't going to have any more to do with Dynamite after I finished my run that I was contracted to do and read Sonya, and that's where it stands now. I mean, it could be. I think they've learned their lesson. I don't think they're going to be working with these hate groups anymore. But time will tell. We'll see.
Okay. Now, you've worked for several publishers, but you seem to have found a home at Ahoy Comics. So talk about that company and your relationship with them.
Yeah, Ahoy's great. I like working with Ahoy a lot because it's not like a sort of factory there. It's more like working in like a coffee shop or, a bookstore. They allow you the freedom to sort of make the comics you want, and they are looking for funny comics, which is really sort of rare in the comics world. Most comics companies don't want anything to do with the comic that's actually comical. They, like the kiss of death to the comic. But they actively seek that out, and they're also highly literary, which I also really like. So they're like kind of like my jam. They're publishing the kind of comics I myself as a reader would like to read. And so it just made sense for me to go there as a creator. So, but yeah, I have a really good working relationship with them. I think largely because they get my sensibility. This is precisely the sort of comic, like Second Coming and Billionaire Island are precisely the sort of comics they're looking to publish. Mm-hmm. So I'll do something with them as long as they'll have me.
And I understand that Second Coming, it will indeed have a second coming. There's
it will
second season.
Well put. There will be a second series. The Second Coming comes out December 16th. It's already the first issue is already done, already produced, and I've written all 6 issues for the second series. Richard's still doing the artwork. He's busy drawing away. But yeah, I'm really excited, and I hope we're able to go for 3 or 4 different seasons.
Okay, great. And of course, the collected edition of Billionaire Island has just come out in comic stores, and it's going to be in bookstores November 24th. Anything else coming up you can talk about?
Yeah, I've got the Superman versus Imperious Lex series coming out with DC in January, part of their Future State series, which I'm really excited about. And that teams me up with Steve Pugh, the artist who did the Flintstones and Billionaire Island. So I'm always happy to work with Steve, and I'm really excited to tell this story about Lexor, a planet where Lex Luthor is the most worshipped man on the planet, and Superman is their greatest villain.
Okay, great. Well, thanks a lot for talking to us today. I'm looking forward to seeing the second coming of Second Coming.
Great. I hope you like it.
Billionaire Island and Second Coming are published by Ahoy Comics. The Flintstones and Snagglepuss are published by DC. Want to support this podcast? You can help us out by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics, and go to deconstructingcomics.com to connect to us on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, to shop on Amazon to support the show, and to find links to subscribe to the podcast. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and we'll critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. This Saturday, a new edition of Critiquing Comics, in which Mulele and I discuss Chad in Amsterdam, Issue 5. Yes, Chad is back already, and this may be the best issue of all. Check out our discussion this Saturday. Then next Wednesday, Kumar and Emmett discuss the manga series Dorohedoro by Q Hayashida. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.